evening, and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and during our half-hour programs, I talk to writers about their careers in writing, their past, their futures, how they got started, how they stay inspired. As you know, we cast a very, very wide net. We've had poets, novelists, nonfiction writers. We've had people who write and paint, write and sing. We cast, as I say, a very wide net. We're open to suggestions as well. If you'd like to help on the show or if you'd like to be on the show, watch for our address at the end of the program. Tonight's guest is Roger Martin, and for many of you on Cape Ann, that's a familiar name. Roger Martin is a distinguished painter and a professor of painting who taught for many years at Montserrat in Beverly. He's also a writer and has the title, the official title, the Poet Laureate of Rockport, something that he told me on the phone with mixed pride and maybe a little of embarrassment, as if there shouldn't be a Poet Laureate, but I think it's a wonderful title, and I'm very proud to have him on the show. Roger Martin's resume is one of the most impressive I've seen in the 5 years I've been interviewing writers here on the program. He has a list of solo exhibits that's almost a page long, a long list of group exhibits, and a distinguished list of publications from his writing as well. Among them, articles in the North Shore Magazine, the Boston Globe, and Child Life magazine. Poetry has included an anthology published in Rockport, Poetry for Rockport. He is published in the Gloucester Daily Times. He is published in Pegasus, and as well has done 10 artist proofs and 40 prints. I believe that's what you brought this evening. Is that?
Yes, seven poems and 7 woodcuts.
7 poems accompanied by 7 woodcuts, a beautiful graphic work which we will later show you, in which Roger Martin's going to read from. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, John.
I'm very happy that you could make it. It's not always easy at the end of a long day, but I appreciate your coming down.
Well, you made me take a bath today, anyway.
I'm sorry. I'm sure your wife is happy.
Yes.
Just before the show, I mentioned that I was going to mention painting in the introduction, and I forgot to mention the painting. I'm indebted to Roger for bringing down one of his works, which is part of our background here, right behind me on the flat. And I'm going to ask him to describe that as he did to me just before the show.
Well, it's a paint stick oil painting on canvas, and it's done based largely, totally, on Mahler's Fifth Symphony, which I'm inordinately fond of. There's one violin note in there that makes me cry every time I hear it. It just goes on and on and on, and it's wonderful. And I tried to get some of that stringiness in the painting.
Is this an old work or a recent work?
Well, let's see. It should be in the corner. 93.
93.
Not too old.
Is there? I noticed in the background of the greens and the blues, above the white, there are some. Well, you said a stick.
Paint stick.
It looks as if there might be a name in there, or.
It's calligraphic in a way.
Is it? Is Mahler's name in there?
No, I'm not that clever. But these paint sticks are oil paint in stick form, like a big second-grade crayon that the kids scrabble with. And I guess probably that's why I like them, because I'm still a big kid in many parts of my life.
Oh, I see. I'm not familiar with that. I thought that you put the oil on the canvas and then moved it around with a stick. But the stick is the instrument
right.
Of the paint.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that down. I like Mahler very much myself. And I'm trying to. Is that the one with the huge chorale?
No.
At the end?
No. It's the one with sort of the bugle announcement at the beginning, sort of militaristic, and then it calms down and gets very, very, I think, sentimental.
Do you paint to music often?
All the time. My interest in music, my ear, such as it is, ranges from Dixieland to soft rock and roll. That's about as far as I'll go toward heavy metal.
Give me an example of a soft rock and roll.
Well, the Charlie Daniels Band. I guess that's really not rock and roll. It's sort of country rock, but I like the beat in that. I can sort of dance at the easel when I'm
So
painting.
you listen and paint at the same time.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
listen and then silently think about Mahler later or Charlie
This
Daniels.
painting worked both ways, but usually when I'm working, I crank it up. I've got a 4-speaker setup in the studio, and my wife came raging in from the store the other day saying, "My God, the neighbors can hear every note." I used to do that when I had my studio in the Cove and played a particularly loud segment of my collection, and this voice from the back window, Dave Medoff next door, said, "Nice concert today, Raj."
Are you familiar with a book by William Meredith called Hazard the Painter? It's a
No.
collection of poems in the voice of a person named Hazard, who's a painter.
Oh.
He talks about the Rolling Stones in it.
Oh, really? That sounds like something I'd be
It's
interested
a
in.
wonderful book.
Right now, excuse me. Right now, I'm reading Farley Mowatt's Born Naked, which is a wonderful take. If you haven't read it, I advise, and the viewers, I advise everyone to read it. It's a great book.
What is that again?
Farley Mowat, the Canadian Never Cry Wolf, Whale for the Killing, who made I Won't Do This because I'm not wearing a kilt, but he went on Canadian television and wore a kilt. And the interviewer was being coy, a female. Now, I'm not against the ladies. And she asked Mr. Mowat, everyone wonders what the Scotsman wears under his kilt. He stood up and lifted it up, and he had nothing on. And he was permanently banned from Canadian television on the spot.
They didn't show that, did they? Clip that out?
I
Or
would
was this
imagine.
live?
I don't know. It was probably live. He's the man also who fired his rifle at American B-52s 3 miles up because they were violating his airspace.
I think he missed them, didn't he?
Right, yeah.
I'm fascinated. I was fascinated before this evening began by the combination of the two art forms,
Uh-huh.
writing, poetry especially, and art. I'm always interested in mixed disciplines, and especially if they're artistic disciplines. Now I'm even more interested because you're fascinated by music as well.
Yes.
How did you get interested in, well, the first is art.
The first is
and
art.
then I take it poetry came later.
Poetry came quite a bit later after the painting and the
How did-
illustration.
How did the art begin, and how did the writing come from that?
The art,
If it did come from that.
well, I don't know where it all comes from. I keep an extensive journal, and I was writing about this impulse, the source. Where does it come from? My wife, both my first wife and Anne, were and are believers, in a deity, and I don't happen to be. Not that I can give a word to it, but I'm still puzzled about where this comes from. I feel like I'm a conduit. This stuff just sort of comes through, and I let it out. As far as your question goes, art began as soon as I could pick up a pencil. I've always drawn. Most of my high school peer group, my whole school peer group, which was spent in Rockport, know me for my well-decorated algebra papers.
Were your parents artists?
No. My mother was a Finnish immigrant, came over here when she was 7 years old. My father's people came from the Azores, which this is one of the few, I think, places on the planet where Portuguese and Finns intermarry. It's one of the few places where they have the opportunity, probably, with the fishing and the granite quarries and everything. So my father told me that his mother painted, but she was Welsh and Scots. She snuck in under the Portuguese and Finns.
Celtic, huh?
Yeah.
Celtic background. So you always
Always drew. But I got into art school totally by accident. A friend who I met in California in 1946. It's a long story, and I don't want to take up the interview talking about it, but it was a total accident, like a lot of things in my life. I was spending my 52-20 club, as we called it, after World War II. I was in the Coast Guard, and I met a man out in California where I had moved. One of my old shipmates told me to come on out. The streets are paved with gold in L.A., so I believed him like a damn fool. And
it wasn't true?
it wasn't true, and after about 6 months, I was longing for the East Coast. I felt a little like, having heard it many years later, the crack in Bert Nye, one of the two went to the West Coast, and somebody said, "How'd you like it?" He said, "Too damn far from the ocean." The right
Sounds
ocean.
like Ferdinand.
Yeah, yeah. And so we came back. This same guy worked a way of getting back to the East Coast for nothing, and we traversed the country. And he tried to get me to go to college. I had not thought of it because I was last in class to get my diploma, and those were days when academic ranking was the first one to get the diploma. So that tells you what kind of a student I was.
Is it Rockport High?
Rockport High, yeah. They skipped me in the second grade, you see, and I never tuned in until the second year of art school into education. In the meantime, I was educating myself. I always have been a voracious reader. And one of my favorite stories was to do with Mabel Woodfall, our old librarian, who finally was convinced that I was able to read Raphael Sabatini and Edgar Rice Burroughs long before my time, and she let me into the adult stacks.
And you were
Pretty young.
kidding her along, and
No, I was serious. I wanted something more than Dr.
clean his
Doolittle.
shirt, or how did you convince her of that?
Just the fact that I seemed to really want to do it, and I came back and talked about the content of the book, so she knew I wasn't in there looking for dirty passages.
And of course, you never did.
Oh, never,
Never did
never.
find those.
Except for Mademoiselle something or other.
I'm always interested in this multidiscipline aspect because it interests me whether all of the arts seem to want the artists want to express deep felt consciousness and emotion about perceived beauty. Is that the same then for painting?
It must be.
Or
It must
music,
be.
or for your poetry?
There's a
does
visual-
Does it feel as if it comes from the same part?
Yeah,
in you?
no question about it. It's an interdiscipline, and it's part of the total package. And I try lately, I've been rather under the weather all summer, so you'll pardon me, I'm currently on prednisone, so I'm high as a kite. And the energy release has been fantastic, like I've been shot out of a
Share
cannon.
some of that later on. after the
Okay.
show.
I didn't bring it with me. So I divide my days, like today, equally, half writing and half painting. And yet there's a visual element to writing, I find. I have a word processor, and I really love to see the words forming on the screen. And it's so much, for me, broader in that, in all the years I've been painting seriously, since 1959, probably 2 or 3 of my columns for the Gloucester paper communicate to more people than all the paintings I've done in that time. That blows me away. I have had people come up to me on the streets and say they send my columns to Reno, Nevada, and the Virgin Islands, and this is fantastic. That's a bonus.
Yeah.
The actual process of watching the words form, I love it. And of course, I love the word processor because I can get the spell checker out.
What kind of word processor do you have?
WordPerfect.
WordPerfect, that's what I use too.
I think it's a great program. I got the 6.0A.
I didn't know that
Big
was out.
time. Yeah.
I know.
It's an upgrade.
You're way ahead of me.
I recommend it. The button bar is terrific.
Does it include ideas?
No. No.
But I'm waiting for that program.
I haven't run out of them yet.
Good, good. I want to ask you next about a product of a couple disciplines you brought.
Okay.
The 7 woodcuts and the 7 poems. And,
This is excuse me.
I almost stopped and asked you how you keep getting ideas, but I wanted to make sure
Okay.
that we have plenty of time to go.
Oh,
to them.
excellent. This is a portfolio which I did as the recipient of Montserrat's first sabbatical, and I misread the conditions of the sabbatical, which I'll tell you about in a minute. This was produced by Bob Perigo in Essex and myself. Bob Perigo is a wonderful artist himself and an old-time letterpress man, and he's got some wonderful old presses in his home.
He's done some work for me. I didn't know he was an artist as well.
Well, he does a lot of linoleum cuts and so forth for his printing projects.
He's got a wonderful little
He is a
plant there.
grand man.
He's done some invitations for me, so
Yeah.
fine old hand.
Yes,
Hand
yes.
stamped.
He ran these things through that press 3 times to get this because the ink had to be different for the wood block. These are done from wood blocks. And the inking had to be heavier for the block than it is for the type. So we've got one pass, two passes for the black type, and a third pass for the little red capital letter at the top. Remarkable achievement, and it was great working with them. This is Mill Pond, which is a little pond down behind where I grew up through the Union Lane Cemetery, and spent a lot of time there when I was much younger. Hornpout, musk, minnow, tadpole, dart, green, brown, water humming to spindle-legged dance. Among your feeder streams flow currents of dough-ball afternoons, and moonlit ice washed down with pilfered wine, in headlong race to leave your reeds and pads for darker tarns in strange and alien places. That has to do with...
It's a delightful poem.
Thank you.
Midnight Ice, I like it. Dough ball.
Fishing for hornpout with dough balls on the end of a little hook.
Yes.
And the pilfered wine I did for 2 winters before my father finally discovered that his wine bottles were getting very pink instead of red. I tried to keep the level the same with water.
How many?
7 in the edition, and an edition of 40.
Edition of 40.
Yeah, yeah.
When you did the 7 poems and 7 woodcuts, then did you have these available in a bookstore, say at Toad Hall, or did
I have not had them available. They are for sale, however. We happen to have, as Bob and Ray used to say, a laughably overstocked surplus warehouse.
How
300 for the edition, which I think is a steal of the century.
I don't think there are, well, I don't know how many, but I bet there are not 10 printers like Bob Perigo still doing that that kind of actual hand typesetting.
He is a rare person in many ways, not just for his printing. He and his wife Connie. If I may, this is called Bill of Lading, and it has to do with what we talked about earlier, the Portuguese and the Finnish, my ancestry such as it is. I was going to bring a flag I have, and maybe if I come back in 4 or 5 years, I'll bring it from the schooner Nellie Florence, which sailed out of Rockport one day and got caught in a storm just off Thatcher's and blew their sail away. They put out a sea anchor, that broke, and they got driven before the storm for 4 days and 4 nights. All they could eat was raw potatoes and molasses because they were afraid to open the hatches for fear she'd founder, and they wound up eventually being driven ashore on Old Orchard Beach, Maine. And the captain was Captain Joseph Martin, my great-grandfather, and in the crew was Joseph Martin Jr., my grandfather. So my roots on that side go pretty deep into Rockport.
Is that an old family recipe now, molasses and raw potatoes?
I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole,
like
no.
That doesn't sound too appetizing.
Too appetizing.
No,
but I'm sure they were glad to have it.
I'll bet.
Bill of Lading. My manifest shows passage from Lascaux to Pigeon Cove, from Finnish and Azorian shores to the cusp of Andrews Point, in steerage and on crossbrace, on reindeer sled and open boat, along cliffs alive with legend, capped with bracken soaked in blood. I have molded fecund figurines in dark windy caves, been pierced by northern winds, and heard the cries of whales. Ancient spirits from out of time sing a cappella with my devils as they chart a course to home port and beyond. And there are 5 more, which I will not take up all your time.
Have you submitted the poems independently, or have they been published independently of this
Some of
edition?
these have been published in the Poetry of Rockport and in the North Shore Writers Workshop. I am in the process, after this summer having been spent sort of under the weather, of really pushing. I'm trying to get out into the market and see if I can become a published poet laureate. I'm perhaps the only unpublished poet laureate anywhere.
Well, you don't want to go. You want to go public and
spoil the image.
Yeah. You want to stay pure.
Right.
Could you read another one for us?
Oh, I'd be happy to.
I'd be delighted to hear another.
My father died at sea in 1961, and he was boarding a tanker. He was a pilot, and this has to do with. Okay, I'm sorry. with my remembrance of him and remembrance. There's a reference here which, if time permits, I'll expand on after I read the poem. This is Requiem. Gulls careen the painful blue over my father's patch of sea. The whistle blast beyond Salvages, my run to the attic, the billowing signal dormer, his answering plume, no more. Big black boats with turbaned decks will dock and depart as before that snow-squalled flow-sliding night off Baker's. The sea is running as his rainbowed bones sift restlessly in the surge. That has to do with an awful lot. The whistle blast beyond Salvages. He was a towboat captain, a seagoing towboat, and he used to tow from as far away as, well, Nova Scotia to Norfolk. And those were in the days when a lot of commerce was done with barges, and he'd have 4 or 5 barges behind his towboat sometimes. And when he could, he'd let my mother know when he was apt to be passing Cape Ann, because this is a navigational point, of course. And he'd come in as close to Salvages as he dared, and this was an old coal-fired steam towboat, the Neptune, and he'd set off a number of blasts, and you could hear it all over town. And my mother would send me up to the attic with a sheet, and I would open the dormer and wave this big sheet, and he'd toot back because he'd have his glasses on the house. That's how we kept in touch. Sometimes, well, I wouldn't see him for 2 or 3 months,
Weeks,
but every once in a while, we'd hear the blast, and we'd know he's going by.
And when was that?
Oh, gosh, when I was 6 or 7, that would be in the very early 30s. And the big black boats with turbine decks, I used to go, when I was about 10, I'd take the train to Boston and walk the length of Atlantic Avenue when the middle of Atlantic Avenue still had freight cars in the middle of it. There were railroad tracks down the middle of Atlantic Avenue. And I'd walk down to Lewis Wharf, get on the Neptune, and spend the day while he docked boats in Boston Harbor. And I'll never forget the day he boarded a rusty old bucket of a collier with a foreign crew. She was riding high because she had just emptied, and he had to climb this spindly ladder. It looked like it went forever. And he told me to sit on that stool in the wheelhouse. The first mate was going to take over, and just sit there and stay out of his way. And then he went down and climbed this ladder, disappeared over that railing. It looked 100 feet in the air, and I'm looking up there. Wow, where the hell what's going to happen to my father? The next thing I see leaning over that railing is a Lascar sailor with a turban and a fierce beard holding up a freshly slaughtered goat. And I said, I'm not going to see my father again.
That would be a little frightening. It would be frightening if you were older.
That's true.
It was 10 years old.
You know, here's a goat hanging with its neck slashed, bleeding all over the side of the vessel. And the snow-squalled, flow-sliding night, he was 67 years old, boarding a tanker in a blizzard off Salem, off Baker's Island. And the pilot boat skipper got him aboard, and he slipped off the ladder. My father's last heard, maybe not, well, recorded, yeah, I was going to say, but last heard and recorded words on the face of the earth were, "Throw me a goddamn line." That's a great epitaph for my father.
Still hoping. When was that? He was 67?
He was 67 in 61.
1961.
61.
So 33 years.
Yeah, that was a shock. I just couldn't imagine this vital man gone.
Yeah.
And I got, as long as we're talking about my father, if I may.
Please.
I've got one here that I really feel I did a fairly good job on, mainly because it says what I set out to do. Now, I'm going to use a prop. This was my father's knife. I wear it in my left-hand pocket, whether I've got a tuxedo, a fireman's uniform, my fishing pants, wherever I go, that's with me. The title of this poem is My Father's Knife. Talisman in pants pocket, always the left pocket. Without the ballast, I feel a starboard list. Comforting small bulk resting athwart the upper thigh, a condition of completeness. I still recall the metallic click against the amber ring on his dark and sweaty hand when he pruned blossoms past their prime and cut cords to hold weak stems to stakes in countless dawns and dusks. Brassy metal scratched and worn, blade eroded from constant hones, surfaces etched by dirt from many plots and inked with summer sweat from 2 gardening generations and the dottle of countless pipes. Looking at my dirt-streaked hands as they work my garden soil, I stand once again mutely at his side, consumed by love and envy of his casual competence, unable to express it. This small marker of time weighed heavy in my pocket as the slanting winter sun stressed the undertaker's rouge, and I wept a lifetime of tears for all we never said.
Delightful
That's perhaps
poem.
a better
Delightful
requiem.
poem, yeah. The recent death of the 4 Gloucester fishermen must be very poignant for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, my heart goes out to all those families, and I know what they are going through. It's no help to them.
Yeah.
But, of course, my mother was still alive when my father died this way. Yet, it's a cliche, and yet I know, given the choice, he'd have taken that over a nursing home
Rather than
any
a
day.
hospital or a nursing home.
Yeah. I can't imagine him in any way inhibited or incapacitated.
Do you have another poem you'd like to read for us?
I do.
We have about maybe we have 2 minutes if you have, if you have a
In the
short
studio, you talked about the process.
Yes.
In the studio, I wait. I sit and wait. I tidy up the paint stick table, riffle through old sketchbooks. My unseeing eye idles past the garage bulging with 35 years of painting. I move the easel, its shadow on the wall too strong a reminder of the old studio, the old marriage, and the long days and nights spent working while she slept upstairs. The chance flip of a sketchbook kicks a shadowy impulse that guides me into the snowy infinity of taut canvas. A mark is made, and another, until the past is put to rest. Knowing the stalling stutter will come again, but for now, everything is possible as I impose my peculiar sense of order on the surface, thinking only of the next mark.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I enjoyed this very much. I just got the sign from our cameraman, Mike Perillo, that we're almost out of time. So I want to thank you very much, Roger Martin, for coming down to the Writer's Block this evening. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for having me, John.
I want to thank all of you out there in TV land, too. If you've learned something about the possibility of triple inspiration from painting and poetry and music, then we've done our job here on the Writer's Block tonight. I hope to see you again next week. Good night.